Hi, I'm Mike from 1A Auto. We've been selling auto parts for over 30 years.
Use a large pry bar or a flat-bladed screwdriver to remove the wheel cover. Just kind of slide it between the wheel and the plastic. Pop it off. These lug nuts are a 21mm socket. I'm going to use that and a breaker bar to loosen them while the vehicle's on the ground. Going to raise and support the vehicle. We're using a 2-post lift, but you can use a jack and jack stance. The lug nuts are loose. I can take my socket and finish removing them. Just gonna hold on to the wheel. I'll take the last lug nut off. It's gonna be loose. Don't want to drop it. Drop the lug nut, that's okay. Just don't want the wheel to fall. Before you begin, make sure that your wheel is straight ahead. The intermediate steering shaft is located here between the steering rack and the steering column. Bolts the steering rack right here. If you're going to reuse this intermediate steering shaft instead of replace it, you'll want to make a match mark between the steering rack and the intermediate steering shaft so that when it goes back together, you'll line those lines back up. In our case, we're going to replace this entire steering shaft. We'll spray this lower bolt with rust penetrant. Use a 12mm socket and a 1/4-inch drive breaker bar to loosen this bolt. It's 12mm. There we go. Now I've got it loosened up. Let's switch to a ratchet. I'm going to remove the bolt, but I will leave the steering shaft on the steering rack right now. I'm just gonna put some more rust penetrant on there so that when it comes time to break it free, it should slide off. Again, make sure that your steering wheel stays straight ahead. We're gonna move underneath the dashboard. You don't have to remove this plastic trim above your knees. Slide in under here, and there is a bolt going through the collar right here on the top. I'm going to remove it. I'm going to use the 12mm box wrench because there's low clearance between the steering column and this bolt. Switch to a ratcheting box wrench, try to fit it in there. It's a little too big. Just switch to the open end because now I've broken it free. Get it loose, and I can pull it out with my fingers. There's the bolt. Can slide this down and off the splines, just like that. The steering wheel is going to be really loose. Again, make sure it stays nice and straight ahead. Next, we need to remove this clamp so that the steering shaft will slide out of the rubber boot where it is in the firewall. Let's see if I can pop this clamp off. Lift it up a little bit. Free it. Leave it right in place. Pull the rubber boot. It's like an inner boot with an outer boot. That to separate them. And maybe the entire shaft will pull straight up and out. Might still be stuck on the steering rack. Okay, we go down underneath and pop it off of the steering rack. Now that the intermediate steering shaft is loose up top, I'm going to reach in and try to wiggle it off the splines that's on the top of the steering rack. Use a punch and a hammer, try to break it free. Now with it released from the steering rack, I go back in the interior and just slide it right out. Here's our old intermediate steering shaft, our brand new one from oneauto.com. Similar in design, similar setup with the small splines that are in here and the pinch bolts. Got our little dust boot that goes through the firewall. They both telescope. It's very stiff. That one telescopes. This one telescopes as well. This should fit in the car. It'll work great for you. Put the new shaft into the firewall opening. We'll grommet in there for now. Pull this out. Put it in roughly the same place as the one we took out. Steering wheel is still nice and straight. Wiggle that over so it sits. Install the bolts. Get it started by hand. I'm going to try to use a ratcheting wrench if it fits. I'm going to switch to the box wrench. And just that way I can give it a final tighten. I'm just going to bring this down until it feels nice and tight. You don't have to kill it. And right there feels good. So this little boot just slides right into the boot coming through the firewall. It's sort of like a grommet. I can reinstall the clamp. Pop this back over into a groove. Take one of those pliers, push these together till it locks. Locked into place. Now I can go back under the car to the steering rack. Before I put the steering shaft back onto the steering rack, I want to clean off all this rusty garbage that's sitting on here. I'm just going to take a rag and I'll wipe off as much as I can. Take some brake parts cleaner, spray it. Put it down. Now I've got this cleaned off. I'm going to put a little bit of white grease on here to just help the steering shaft slide back onto the steering rack. Now you want to make sure this is fully seated, because when the bolt goes through this, it actually sits in this little groove in here on the steering rack, and it helps prevent it from pulling off. So since this is collapsible, I can push it up, and then our wheels are still straight ahead. I'm going to pull it down. I don't want to turn it. Just want to get it over the splines. Just slide it straight down. Just like that. And I can feel that the steering rack shaft has come up all the way through the collar. Reinsert the bolt. The bolt threaded in. I'm going to take a 12mm socket and ratchet. Finish tightening it down. Make sure it's nice and tight. And right there feels good. Steering shaft is replaced. As always, it's recommended that even though we kept the wheels nice and straight, you should have the alignment checked by a shop. Reinstall our wheel. Important to note, these lug nuts have a taper. The taper meets the wheel, matches the inside of the wheel. Don't install them with the flat side like this, that is incorrect. Install them with the taper to the wheel. It helps locate the wheel on the lug nut stud. I'm just using the socket and ratchet to bring these down snug before I put the car on the ground. We torque the lug nuts to 76 foot-pounds. Going in a cross pattern. Reinstall the hubcap. Going to line up the opening for the valve stem with the valve stem on the wheel. Just push it in place.
Thanks for watching. Visit us at oneauto.com for quality auto parts, fast and free shipping, and the best customer service in the industry.